Okay, I'd like to discuss the nature of our problem when it comes to texturing items for the Cities Skylines game. This is a building that I built for another application. You could use this in like DAZ Studio or any kind of 3D app where you wanted to create a cityscape. But the reason I'm showing this to you is I wanted to show the differences in what we're dealing with between a more traditional type, or what I would consider a more traditional type of building 3D assets compared to game assets. Now, in this brick on this surface is a 2K texture right here. Or excuse me, I'm sorry. Wrong one. I have a hard time talking and working at the same time. My brain doesn't multitask very well. This is a 2K texture of that brick, and it is tiled roughly 3 times across the face of this surface. Now that's a pixel density of around 351 pixels per foot. This shutter is also a 2K image. It is not tiled. This window is about 7 feet wide, so that's roughly a 300 pixels per foot. If you look at some details like this light fixture, that's a 1K texture, or 1024 by 1024 on that light fixture. That's what? 4 or 5 inches width and wide. Now to compare that to a texture that we are going to use in a game asset, this is one of my brick panels, and this will be applied to a panel in our building that is 12 foot tall. And I know that this is going to be spanning an area of anywhere from 200 to 300 pixels. Reduce that down to 300 pixels. You can see how tiny it gets. That's at 300 pixels. That's at 200 pixels. So I just wanted to show you the comparison in quality between you're tremendously constrained as to the quality and detail that you can put into a model for the game Cities Skylines. Now our in-game textures cannot exceed 2048 by 2048. Is to break this building up into different chunks, and in the asset editor you can bring in submeshes so that and each submesh can have its own texture. So the way I've set this up is so that this tower and this tower has its own set of UVs. Then this tower in front and this building here has its own set of UVs. Then that wall and that. So we've got what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 meshes that make up this entire piece. And here you can see the ambient occlusion that I have applied to these. Now, when you're working with buildings in game, you really need ambient occlusion, because if you don't add it, because it's not a physically based render in game, the lighting and rendering is not that sophisticated, so you need to give your model a little bit of a bootstrap, if you will, to give a little bit of oomph. If you don't do a ambient occlusion pass on your model, it's going to look flat and washed out. I see a lot of models that online that, you know, they're halfway, that people have made for Cities Skylines. They look like they're halfway decent models, but they haven't bothered to put an ambient occlusion pass on it. And that's this darkening that you see. Now, the way you use ambient occlusion is you save out those maps, and then you, in Photoshop, you layer the ambient occlusion pass on top of your color texture, and you set the ambient occlusion to multiply. So that's layered on top of your color texture. Now, some of this I might tone down. It might be, you won't really know what this is going to look like until you actually get it laid on top of your texture. Some of this might be a little strong, so I might reduce the opacity of that a little bit. But it dramatically enhances the appearance of your model. So we were looking at this one 12-foot panel here. And if we look at just this one, you can see that that is broken up into numerous different panels. Now, when I was originally laying this out, I had stacked all of these panels on top of each other to try and reuse that mesh over and over and over again. And by stacking panels, I could get more of this building into just one texture. But I was running into great difficulties with the ambient occlusion pass, because when you stack panels, those panels come into proximity to other elements, so they don't, while the panel itself may share the same texture, it does not share the same proximity that the other, so like here, if each one of these panels across here, you could stack those and have them all share the same texture, and it worked just fine. But the problem is that they don't share the same ambient occlusion over them. So I finally got tired of messing with it and just went ahead and broke this building up into multiple chunks, and then that way I was able to get a halfway decent building out of it. Okay, so the workaround that I was talking about in the asset editor, as I said, we can break our mesh up into different chunks. And this really is very easy to do. It's much easier to do than I thought it would be. Now, I always use building electricity. I'm going to be including this building in the game as an asset, or in the map as an asset. I want it to appear when the map is loaded. I'm not an expert in many aspects of this game, but it's correct me if I'm wrong. Please leave a comment below and set me straight. But if you use other building types, it seems to me that you have to reach a certain population or what have you before that building can even be used. Building electricity, you put it on the map and it stays there. You can position it however you want to position it. So for my money, it's much more flexible. I mean, when I put something in a environment, I want it to stay where the hell I put it. And the only drawback to building electricity is that you have to place it on water first for some reason. I have no idea why that is, but you got to put it on water first and then use move it to move it into position. Okay, so here is the first section that I've brought in. So we can go here to submeshes, add new. So this is not, obviously not textured. This does not, now this one is not the version I have right now that I showed you just a minute ago where I had 5 sections. I had to do further refinement on that model. But here you can see how easy it is to bring submeshes into your game. And then once you have these all together, then you go ahead and save that out as one unit. Okay, I wanted to show some of the checker maps that I use. Checker maps are vital when UVing anything. This is one that I downloaded from the internet. I don't use this a lot, but it does help you. It's good for comparing the size of your UV layouts from one part of the building to the next. It's got these nice big squares that help you line up one panel to the next to make sure that your textile density is close to being the same. It also helps you see if your UV item is really tiny, which a lot of mine are. You can see these lines and see if these lines are holding up with good detail or if they're getting fuzzy. This is another one that I use, more of a standard checker map. Again, it's good for comparing the size of these squares from one side to another. Like if I take that building part, set that to checker, so you can see it applied there. We'll do the same here, change that material to checker. So even though this is a different mesh and this is a different mesh. That way you can come in here and look and see, although they don't line up, you can see that they're pretty much the same size. And then you can do that to all of them and make sure that you have consistent size across for your textures across. They vary a little bit, but they're close enough. This is one that I made up, kind of drives your eyes crazy, but this is one I made up for working with really small pieces to help you visualize direction and size. This really isn't too good for larger surface areas, but for really small parts, that's good. This one I made up just a bunch of colored arrows as a directional indicator, and it's really valuable because you'll get when you're UVing, you'll get panels that are turned the wrong way or facing the wrong direction. And here you have your identifiers as the colored arrow, which is a good if you don't have something like that, you really don't know which direction your panels are facing. Now, since I've done I guess what you might call this a more traditional layout here, it doesn't really matter. Like here you can see that those, and I use the algorithm in the game to pack these UV islands or panels into as close a space as possible. Sometimes it will invert panels like you see it's done here just to fit them into a smaller space. And I'll be texturing that in Photoshop, so I'll just flip the texture upside down when I do that. Now, most of the model I did away with the UV stacking, but for the roof, because the roof covers such a huge surface area, and I really didn't want to make, I don't think ambient occlusion is as critical with the roof. Here you can see I've got some on these dormers. Now these dormers are stacked, and I left them as such, so you can see I selected that one face right there, and you can see that that is covering multiple dormers. And here's another one. So all of these will share the same texture. And here you can see all of these roof panels are stacked up. And then one texture will cover all of those. But the directional UV checker is really handy to make sure that when you're stacking, you haven't reversed panels or flipped them around in some fashion. So if I'm UVing an element, say like this tower here, and when you're UVing stuff, there's more than one way to skin a cat. And it's a process of refinement. You know, almost everything I make, even as long as I've been doing this, it's still a process of refinement. It's like I have to find the 6 or to 10 different ways of how not to do it, quite frankly. But there's always several different ways to do things. So here is this tower, and I have So if I were to, and what I've done here in this layout is I've separated these elements because these are a different color and I wanted to separate them a little bit. This ring is a different color. And that's all those guys. But you can project it. That's as an atlas, and here you can see what it's doing is taking all those panels and laying them out flat. And then these rings right here is not something that you would want, but that's the tops. You can see right there, it's just that one ring around there. Let's say you had an object like this doorway. So this is this doorway entrance. And you can set this to front, project from view, and then I will, depending on the circumstances, sometimes I'll come in at an angle like here and just eyeball it and project these corners. And then this one, and then combine them. You could project this as an atlas, which gives you that type of layout. This is not ideal. What I will do in some circumstances is this line right here is the top edge of that window. And sometimes when I do a straight on shot like that, I'll just grab these back lines. See how that line there represents the back of that window insert? And you can select that and then just use your scale tool and draw that in. That will, if this was a highly textured face, you would not want to do it that way because it would distort your textures. But that's really just going to be a solid color. And you can see here, looking at the ambient occlusion, it looks fine. It doesn't care that I've done it that way. Did the same thing with the archway here on that door opening. So if we look at these towers, and these faces I did with project from view, so you can see that that panel reflects that panel right there. That panel reflects that one, and so on and so on. You go all the way around the model, and you have that in here. Obviously is the windows. So when you go through and you're unwrapping all of your different components by using project or project from view, you're going to end up with a whole bunch of things scattered all over the place. And then what you do is you select all of those items and then you can pack them, set your packing gap and all your different parameters, and it will pack all of them into a, hopefully what is the tightest space possible, and eliminating as many gaps and blank areas so that you're taking full use of that area. What I did when I was selecting how much of the building that I would put in one mesh is I did these two towers together initially. So then I had my checker on here, so I've got my size on my black squares, and then I would select an adjacent part of the building to it, and I would keep adding components to it. And in this case, it just, luckily, this was pure luck that this section and this section gave me pretty much matching size on my squares. And then I would then do this section, change its material to the checker, and add components to this. When I first started working with this area, I didn't have this roof section included in it. And so the squares, the texture sizes, weren't matching up. Once I selected that and then packed it, the squares didn't match up. So I added this roof area here to it, repacked it into one mesh, and then that brought my texture size and my squares into close approximation to one another. Now when I run my ambient occlusion pass, now I'm working in Modo. I realize many modelers use Blender, and Blender, as far as I can tell, I've looked at these different things on the internet. I've never used Blender, but it appears to have pretty much the same functionality that Modo has. And you want to set right here under my cursor an ambient occlusion output, probably something very similar in Blender. Now you need to set the range in what in Modo is occlusion range, and I have this set to roughly 24 inches and 256 occlusion rays. I think the default on that's like 64, and the occlusion range is often set to 0 or some different number. You see the distance that the darkness is projecting out. That's what this occlusion range will set for you. Basically, it's not this distance so much, but it's how far the rays travel, because basically the ambient occlusion is made by rendering rays being fired from one surface and hitting another surface to determine if there's a surface adjacent to it. It renders that ambient occlusion. If you have this range set too high, then the first couple of times I ran this, that darkness covered halfway out into this wall, which obviously you don't want to use. Now Blender has the same setting, In Blender, they refer to that as attenuation distance in your ambient occlusion setup. So if I was to run one of these, here's my UV map. If I was to run an ambient occlusion pass on this in Modo, they have it under their game. They have a game section for creating game assets. I would go to Baking Wizard. I'll call that Towers. It will save out the map, so you want to define your destination directory, the size. Now, I have my size and width here set to 4K, 4096 by 4096. The final size is going to be 2K, 2048 by 2048. Because of the complexity of the UV map and being able to see where you're placing things, I'm going to texture all of this at a 4K resolution, and then I'll resample it down to the 2K sample before I use it on the model. That way I can much more easily see what I'm doing. And this wizard's kind of a handy way of doing things. Then you select the mesh, that is your target. You can also use the same baking wizard for baking out normal maps. If you were baking out a normal map, you would have both a source and a target. Select your ambient occlusion output. Here you add what type of baking you want to do. You can bake normal maps and what have you out of here. I have this set to ambient occlusion. And then we'll bake only, and then this will bake out that ambient occlusion map. That'll give you the idea of how I approach those things. And again, some of this is overdone, like right here. I don't know why it made that so dark, but I will go in, and when I'm texturing this in Photoshop, I'll remove this darkness right here, or most of it. It doesn't do a perfect job, like right here. That obviously is no good, so I'll remove that in Photoshop. So that's the end of this video. Next time we'll texture the model and hopefully wrap it up so that we can get back to work on the map. So thanks for watching, and see you next time.